When The Amazing Spider-Man hit theaters in 2012, it set out to reinvent Peter Parker for a new generation. With a darker tone, a fresh cast, and a completely different visual style, this reboot took big risks to redefine the Spider-Man legacy. Today, we're diving into the creative world behind the film, exploring the concepts, designs, and ideas that shaped this new take on the wall crawler. Let's get into it. Let's start with Spider-Man, of course, and take a look at how the ideas evolved, from what we saw in the film to completely different suit designs. Let's start with designs that feature only subtle changes, like this one, for example, where, aside from small details, it still closely resembles the suit we saw in the film. One of the most noticeable differences at first glance here would be, for instance, the logo. Let's start with designs that feature only subtle changes, like this one, for example, where, aside from small details, it still closely resembles the suit we saw in the film. One of the most noticeable differences at first glance here would be, for instance, the logo. Following the same aesthetic we saw in the film, one of the creative liberties taken with the suit's design was the mask's eyes, which were yellow instead of white. Here we can see other variations that were considered for that idea. And finally, in this image, we can start to see some changes in the suit, mainly on the chest. The spider design is more detailed, featuring a red marking similar to that of a Black Widow, and the red section extends up to the chest instead of stopping at the waist. This suit, on the other hand, is more similar to what we saw in the film, featuring a smaller and subtler spider symbol, with the red section on the chest extending down to the waist, but with small blue separations along the abdomen. Here we can also see other designs that experimented with reworking the abdomen area, one of them similar to the previous image, but with large white eyes, more like the ones we saw in the second film. In this image, we can now see a suit more similar to the one from the film, featuring a larger, longer spider emblem that covers the chest, along with bigger white lenses that more closely resemble the comic book design. And now, one of the most curious designs for obvious reasons, one that closely resembles the suit used in Tobey Maguire's trilogy. The original intention was possibly to follow the aesthetic of Sam Raimi's films before moving on to something completely different. Finally, moving on to the strangest designs, we have this one first. It lacks the typical web pattern, features a strange black visor that extends to the back of the neck, has a spider on the side of the chest rather than in the center, and as a final touch, a sort of web cape reminiscent of Spider-Man 2099. Moving closer to a design more recognizable as Spider-Man, we have this one, somewhat strange and almost macabre due to the spider and lens design, with a very subtle white web pattern on the suit. The previous suit evolved, as we can see in this image. There's less red, a smaller spider, and slightly lighter lenses. Additionally, gray was added to the abdomen and parts of the legs, which complements the blue very well. And finally, one that continues the aesthetic of the previous suits, featuring an even more grotesque spider but with a color pattern completely faithful to the classic design. To wrap up the Spider-Man section, we can finally see a suit that was at one point considered as being completely faithful to the comics, with the only notable difference possibly being the smaller than usual eyes, similar to his design from the 1960s. On the villain side, we have Lizard, and in these sketches we can see some discarded ideas for his design, featuring a more terrifying appearance. In this design, for example, we can see how the facial proportions, with extremely small eyes and a narrower mouth, aim to move away from the humanoid appearance that was eventually used. It was even considered to keep his lab coat, as in the comics, something we only saw briefly in the film. A curious detail in this concept art is that we can also see Spider-Man with the previously seen design, similar to Tobey Maguire's version. The decision to shorten his snout and give him a more human-like face was something that ultimately remained in the film. However, here we can see that they even considered keeping part of his skin with its human color. Or how they experimented with different shades of green, types of skin, textures, scales, and even darker green line patterns. There were also designs, like in this case, where they tested how he would look with a more human-like face as well as with one slightly more reminiscent of a reptile. In these designs, we can see how giving the face a more human-like appearance also changed the approach to designing the body, giving it a more humanoid look as well. On the other hand, with a more monstrous and reptilian face, the body was also envisioned as more grotesque and terrifying, with details like patches of pink skin under the arms or small hairs on the back of the neck. And that wraps up our look at the amazing Spider-Man. Whether you love this reboot or not, it's fascinating to see how it reimagined one of the most iconic heroes of all time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what you think about this version of Spider-Man.